since these days it's relatively easy to put together a special meeting like this, we decided to go ahead and do it and keep everything legal and keep our city attorney happy. So we are doing that. So we have on the agenda, first item is the city pool. I thought we had discussed that pretty thoroughly at the last meeting. Ms. Matthews, you suggested that you were still unclear on the council's guidance. My understanding was that we had received the report of the Committee on Recreation and Parks, which was recommending the two items be included in the repairs to the pool. The Finance Committee met and agreed with that. So I'm not sure what else we need to do other than that at this moment. So if you could just share that with us, Ms. Matthews.
Sure, and thank you all for being willing to meet on such short notice. It was really driven more by some issues regarding 45 West Main, specifically one change order. But since we were meeting, I wanted just to make sure that we were 100% clear on your direction regarding the pool improvements and particularly the financing. Just to kind of briefly mention, we are facing, as you all know, some very, very tight deadlines for the bonding piece of this project. And if we do not, as a staff, include the right dates, it could knock the city out of this issuance cycle. So that's why I thought it was important, President Pecoraro, just to kind of confirm everything. So we are planning to introduce the ordinance authorizing the bonding at your meeting on Monday. We obviously need to have a final dollar amount of what is to be financed in that ordinance. And then Ms. Rader, our bond counsel, and and Ms. Palmer will be working with the CDA and its bond counsel just to, they are required to review the public hearing notice and to sign off on that. And there's certain steps we have to take with regard to that public hearing notice. So the dates that we are working with, just to keep everybody on the same page, we have to have the legislation fully effective no later than Wednesday, July 8th of 2020. I mean, that means passed by the Common Council and signed by the mayor. Any withdrawal from the CDA issuance pool, that decision has to be made no later than Thursday, July 23rd. As the more tenured members of the group may recall, that what we typically do in the bond ordinance is it establishes a maximum amount, and there are assumptions made for interest rates that obviously drive certain costs. Typically, the way Ms. Rader has drafted this ordinance is it grants discretion to the mayor to determine the final amount, because those issuance costs and interest rates are not known until the bonds are actually priced. So the date for the city to amend any change in the number that I'm looking for direction for today has to be done once again by Thursday, July 23rd. So we have, once again, a key date of July 8th to have all the legislation passed, and basically what you will be doing in that legislation is setting the maximum amount that the city can be borrowed. It can always be reduced no later than July 23rd, but it cannot be increased. So that's part of the reason, President Pecoraro, I just wanted to make sure everyone's on the same page, because we're about to enter down a path which there is no coming back from if we get it wrong, and if there were any lack of clarity on your direction. Also, these numbers will obviously flow into the budget, but that can always be amended. The bond ordinance cannot be. So what I understand you all to have said was that we were going with the pool within the pool option and the new filtration building and associated plumbing improvements. The value of those improvements based on the Lithorian report was $1,032,000. We had recommended including kind of a plug figure, if you will, for any associated design fees as well as construction management for the project. Ms. Palmer and I have assumed basically 15% of project cost for those expenses. That's, once again, that's obviously an estimate. That brings the total project cost to $1,186,800. There had been some discussion at the Finance Committee meeting of using the proceeds from the sale of West End Place to apply to this project, basically reducing the bonding amount. As the mayor and council president are aware, I did circle back around with Family and Children's Services, who is purchasing the property. Their original plan was to close by June 30th. They have secured their state funding. I explained to them in an email this weekend why I was looking for clarity on the closing date on the property. They will be closing on it, but they cannot guarantee that that's going to happen in the next 60 days. So I did want to throw that out there. If we assume that we're applying the proceeds from the sale of West End Place to the project cost I just stated, that would leave a bonding amount of $756,800. So at this juncture, once again, I want to confirm the bonding amount that I am to instruct Ms. Rader to put into the ordinance. Once again, it can, if you have any, concerns, I would aim high rather than low, because you can always reduce it. You got about a month to do.
And the cost of borrowing the money is the administrative cost. That's static, depending no matter how much you spend, right? Or borrow, right?
Right. So this is basically a project cost. The CDA will determine those issuance costs, which are not included in the figures I just cited. Those are determined by a number of things, including the CDA's own cost for its bond counsel, as well as the number of participants. So if there's more participants, the city's cost, is split among multiple parties. If there aren't a number of participants, it is not. Our contact, meaning mine and Ms. Palmer at the CDA, typically recommends we use 3% of the issuance amount, or the financed amount for issuance cost.
So it's not, excuse me, Mr. President.
Go ahead, Mr. Cavacci.
So by using a 3% number, then it's not actually, that's just for estimation purposes then, because that's not.
That is correct. That is correct. And the way it typically, Ms. Rader has addressed this, and Ms. Palmer, if your recollection is any different, please jump in, because you and I are the two people on staff who work on these issues with Ms. Rader. Typically, the ordinance that will be introduced on Monday night would have a maximum interest cost. So if for some reason, interest costs end up being markedly higher, that would be one way of the city getting out of the issuance. There is usually a maximum amount of issuance cost, once again, that are specified in the legislation, which the city can then determine, if it were to be exceeded, what it wants to do. But it is not a set amount. It is a projection until such time as the issuance is basically priced.
So
and obviously there's other jurisdictions who are still making the same type of decisions we are right now.
Right. Well, I appreciate that there is a little bit of cost involved, but I think we've got two factors going. One is we're about to receive a chunk of money, which I think could be applied to this project, reducing the amount we need to borrow, which I think is prudent to do. And so we're not reducing our cash reserves, by doing that, because we're using money that's coming in from a project that, really kind of came out of the blue in terms of bringing money to the city. The second factor is that, in the moment in which we are now living, I am reluctant to draw down the reserves more than we have to. So to me, those are good arguments for going ahead and bonding some amount of this. I'm mindful of what what Mr. Dayoff always says, and I don't want to put him on the spot because this may not always be his view, but he always says, for big projects of this kind, let's let other generations help pay for it, which I think always makes a lot of sense when we can do that. I mean, if we were totally flush with cash and didn't need to, but I think that in the moment it makes some sense to be a little bit more careful with our reserves. Anybody else have any thoughts?
Mr. President.
Mr. Yingling.
Yeah, to follow up on what the president said in the Finance Committee, we also asked Ms. Palmer about what was our debt service for the city going to look like in the projected years out.
Right.
2020, and if I have the actual years incorrect, please correct me, Ms. Palmer, but I believe that we have some debt being paid off in 2023 and then 2026, which is going to significantly reduce what our debt service is. So to the president's point, I do believe that bonding this out, and I think we did have consensus on the Finance Committee, is the right thing to do. But going back to Ms. Matthews' on the amount. When we discussed in the Finance Committee, one thing we brought up was based on the history of negotiations with Family and Children's Services, where Kevin and Ann weren't around for, we wanted to be somewhat clear when we were going to get that money. So with Matthews, what I'm hearing is that settlement is not exactly known at this point. So I don't think bonding, assuming that money's going to come in the short term, bonding less money in the, easy math, $1 million, we're going to get, 300,000 from the sale of that building. So bonding 700,000 wouldn't make sense. I mean, I think we should, if what I'm hearing is the costs to bond are static, like Councilman Kavachi said, then we need to bond the full amount. When that money comes in from the real estate transaction, then we don't necessarily have to use all of the bonded amount. Am I thinking correctly?
If I can jump in
Councilman Dale's
and
shaking his head, so.
Sure, just let's go
Yeah,
one at a time here.
yeah, I
that-
think a couple things, if we can weigh in. And Ms. Palmer, since you work with the numbers all the time, I do have them in front of me, but could you basically elaborate on the information that you shared with the Finance Committee regarding when we have debt coming off?
Certainly. We have a bond issuance for the Green Street Bridge and some other expenses that originated in 2005. That bond indebtedness will be completely paid off by the end of 2025. We have a 2012 issuance that is actually a refunding from a 2002 issuance that was for the parking garages. That bond indebtedness will come off completely as of 2022, at the end of 2022. So essentially, your change in bond service from year to year will go from about $750,000 to about $425,000.
Right, and if I,
2025.
yeah, and if I may kind of just, once again, I apologize for kind of throwing a bunch of numbers at you. I know it's got to be a little confusing. So we did have, staff requested that the CDA run 2 debt service scenarios for us based on, I think it was your meeting on the 18th. I can't swear to that, one of your earlier meetings. So for scenario 1 was borrowing $1.25 million for a term of 20 years. Scenario 2 was borrowing $1.45 for the same term. For the purposes of this scenario, the true interest cost that was assumed by the CDA worked out to be 2.55%. Clearly, we're not talking about bonding 1.45, so I won't even address those numbers unless someone would like me to. But for the 20-year scenario, borrowing a principal amount of 1.25, the maximum debt service that the city would have in any 1 year was projected to be $81,160. So I thought that information might be helpful, as well as the information Ms. Palmer just provided relative to when we have debt coming off. In terms of Councilmember Yingling's question, once the bonding amount is set, we would not have the opportunity to prepay back any of the principal amount until 10 years, halfway through the issuance, which would be 10 years in the case we're talking about. So the final date that you would be able to lower the amount that we wish to borrow would be July 23rd.
Okay.
So once again, I think just to give yourself flexibility, I think, and I do want to say, Family and Children's Services, I think is very committed to closing on the property. There's no question about their state funding. The way I framed my question to them is, look, we're planning to apply these proceeds to a capital project. We're facing some very tight deadlines to determine the bonding amount, kind of level with us, and where are you at? So their funding is secure. They obviously don't want the city to be reliant on something happening really soon and then it doesn't due to circumstances outside their control. But they do have all their funding lined up and everyone's eager to get going. But I would say at this juncture, for the purpose of introduction of the ordinance on Monday, and for me to provide direction to Ms. Rader, both to complete the ordinance as well as for us to prepare the public hearing notice, once again, if there's any question about this, I would give yourself more flexibility in the ordinance than less. So, I'm sorry.
Ms.
I
Matthews,
apologize.
I just have a question, and it's probably just my lack of knowledge. I know you were talking about bonds. Is there a reason we're not doing a local interest loan instead of the bonds? Is it lower interest using a bond instead? Because if we could pay off a larger amount, say with the proceeds from the sale, that would be less interest and a little more financially wise, if that's possible. I'm just asking, I'm just throwing that question out because I don't know the answer. And I'm just
We
curious.
actually, yeah, no, it's a good question, Councilmember Gilbert, and we actually had, this question came up from one of the members of the Finance Committee, I don't recall which. Ms. Palmer, obviously you have worked in both scenarios, both through the CDA as well as through a bank. I would say we had some discussion about the issuance cost compared to each and the flexibility at the Finance Committee level. Ms. Palmer, would you mind jumping in since you have experience with both methods of financing with the city?
Sure. With the CDA, we typically would experience a lower interest rate simply because there is a much larger issuance. So we pull together with different entities, and so we would get a little bit smaller interest rate. We still have to pay our portion of closing costs and trustee fees. If we went out into a private sector, into a private loan, we would normally do an RFP, and we would normally use our financial consultants to issue that RFP and to evaluate and grade the responses. The last time that we issued privately was for the fiber bond. As you recall, that was at the time we thought it was going to be a $25 million bond. The fees for that consultant were about $50,000. So generally, it works out to be a wash, just because you're going to have the fees related to the consultant, and then you're going to pay a little bit higher interest rate by going out on your own, or you have the CDA where you get a little bit lower interest rate, but you have to pay the issuance cost. So it tends to be a wash either way.
Ms. Palmer, would it be accurate to say that most banks, however, are probably not likely to go out 20 years?
I think, I honestly, I haven't checked what the expected life expectancy is on a pool. I would think that 20 years would probably be okay. I would say that 30 years is off the table.
I just wasn't sure. A lot of times, in my experience, I found that banks may be less willing to go out to the same term that someone like the CDA would do.
I really don't have enough experience there to, sorry.
Oh, that's okay. I think Ms. Rader may have mentioned that at some point, but once again, I think as Tammy's trying to indicate, I think it's a little bit of a judgment call, Councilmember Gilbert, in regard to your question.
Okay, thank you.
All right, any other questions on this?
Yeah, Mr. President, just real
Mr.
quick.
Cavacci.
Also, I believe that when it comes to our credit rating and things like that, there are some advantages to bonding versus loans. I think they're viewed a little bit differently in regards to that in terms of rating. But I think besides just the costs and things like that, I could be wrong, but I think I remember this coming up years ago, and that was part of a conversation as well.
Yeah, to the best of my knowledge, I mean, there's two ways of going out for bonding. One would be for the city to basically go out on its own and to basically secure its own bond rating. I don't believe we certainly have not done that recently. There was a time and a place where you know, probably 15 years ago or so, where you could actually buy bond insurance rather than going through the rating agencies. So that market dried up with all the financial collapse 15, 20 years ago. So
Yeah,
the
we
city
used to have a rating back when I first came on the council.
Right. So that is, that is a complicated process, and it's sort of a crapshoot where you end up. The city would not basically have its own individual rating for the issuance we're talking about. The rating would be assigned to the overall issuance that the CDA is doing. So it would not be tied specifically to the city, but rather to the pool of entities involved in the CDA issuance. So using the CDA's 3%, the figure that when I was working with Mr. Day, who's a state employee, Based on the project cost, we were talking about an issuance cost. That's kind of with the two levels of projects you all were talking about at that time. That's where the ballpark 1.25 came from. If I take the $1,186,800 and multiply it by 3% for issuance cost, it comes out to $1,222,404. We typically have paid for Ms. Rader's services out of pocket. We have typically not financed her cost, just because why pay interest on it if you can afford to do it.
Okay.
So what I believe I'm hearing from you all is you would like us to basically assume at this juncture at least full bonding of the project, being once again the pool within the pool, the plumbing infiltration, and some assumed contractual cost for design and for construction management, plus the issuance cost.
Right. Let's do
for the
that for
CDA.
now. If nobody has an objection, let's do that for now. My hope, and I think a lot of us agree, is that as the settlement comes with the other project, that we'll be able to make a change in that, and hopefully that will take place before the middle of July, which is our expectation.
Okay. Great. And thank you all. Like I said, I just wanted to make sure that because of the fact that we're sort of entering a point of no return, I wanted to make sure that we had your direction.
Sure.
One thing that Ms. Rader did ask me to mention to you all that just came up in a phone call I had with her about 7 o'clock last night. And we were going to have to just explore this issue. I don't think it's overly problematic, but she asked that I mention it to you. As you all, I think, are aware, we have a swim team that basically is considered a private use of the pool, and by federal tax code does define private use fairly broadly. Ms. Rader, I did authorize her to have a conference call with the CDA's bond counsel to flag the city's relationship with the swim team because we need to make sure that any private use of a publicly bonded facility is, my words, not Ms. Rader, basically de minimis. So she sent a whole series of questions to me last night as a follow-up to our phone call, and Ms. Gruber responded to those questions. So her point in asking me to mention this to you all is that, one, there are some federal tax code limitations that restrict, to a certain extent, the city's ability to allow private use of the pool and to receive payments for such use. So I don't believe this is anything that you all really contemplated, but if there was anyone thinking that we could rent out the pool for a lot of private functions as a way of covering debt service, she wanted me to caution you that that would likely not be allowed under federal tax code limitations. So,
Well, I don't think anybody was contemplating that. However, I think we certainly want to continue to allow the swim team to use the pool. I mean, they've got a lot of years there, I think, and it's a good outlet for kids to swim during the summer and develop their skills. So hopefully that we do not make a bigger problem out of that than it needs to be.
It will not be us making a problem out of it. We have a legal obligation to disclose it to the CDA's bond counsel. They will then review it. So the information that Ms. Gruber just provided within the last hour or so has been forwarded to Ms. Rader, who will then take it from there. But this is not really a matter of her opinion or the CDA's bond counsel opinion. It's ultimately a matter of federal tax code as it applies to the city's bonds.
Mr.
So
President.
I'll keep you posted on that.
All right, thank you. Mr. Cavacci.
Yeah, so it just, first of all, they're not a private entity. They're an organization that falls underneath the city as a sponsored activity, just like other recreation and sports activities. So I don't see it being a problem. If for some reason they do, I say the hell with them. We'll not bond it. We'll go out and get a private loan for it. Money is super cheap right now. Banks would love to do business with us and lend us that money, probably almost as cheap as we can bond it out. And we'll just do it that way. If that's ridiculous.
Well, I would need to ask Ms. Rader this. One is, from a legal structure standpoint, the swim team is not a function of the city. It is not a governmental function, and that's very clear. I would need to ask Ms. Rader this, but it is possible because this has to do with the the tax exempt status that is granted to governmental bonds. I will, like I said, I don't believe this is going to be an issue, but I think you all need to be aware, at least that Ms. Rader is will be having conversations with the CDA's bond counsel. I could certainly, I've gone through one issuance that was also done through a private bank, and for federal tax treatment purposes, it was treated no differently than if I'd gone through a bond through the state. That may have been that particular issuance in Tacoma Park, but I will confirm with Ms. Rader. Once again, I don't want to alarm anybody. I think it is a de minimis use, but you know, the CDA is not being difficult. This has to do with the application of federal tax law to bonds, and that's a matter of law. So we will keep you posted. Hopefully the information that Ms. Gruber provided will be enough to, you know, satisfy any federal tax code limitation concerns, but I didn't feel right not at least sharing that with you because that just came up last evening.
President.
All right, Mr. Mayor.
So, I mean, what's the difference between a swim team using our pool and like a separately organized rec council using like ball fields, or is that, or we've just never, or does no one ever bond anything for baseball
yeah.
fields?
You are correct, Mayor Dominic. This comes up in any type of bonding situation that typically involves recreation facilities because, you know, you don't have private entities renting your bridge or your roads. It comes into play if we were bonding some improvements and we had a rec league using it and we were charging for that. It would be the exact same situation in terms of federal tax code limitations.
So I guess my follow-up is, well, thanks for letting us know. I would assume that this wouldn't be a big issue. And I think that, I guess my question is, if anyone has the answer, I don't know if anyone does, is do we know how that usually goes when municipalities or governments bond out any work to ball fields if they ever get turned down because they let little leagues use it?
I do not know that.
Okay.
I don't have any personal experience with that. My experience for most recreation projects has either been park development or aquatic centers.
All right. Well, I don't foresee this being a huge issue. I mean, that's I have no experience with this, but it just seems like, you know, thanks for letting us know, but I think we're going to be okay.
Yeah, I mean, I think the underlying principle is that you don't want favorable tax status granted to governmental bonds that are then basically in the facilities are then used for private use. That's the issue.
It's obvious to avoid, you know, the discriminatory uses of the pool where we try to keep certain groups out. That's certainly far from the case here.
Right.
You know, we're just operating a service for the people. So let's not get too wound up about it right now.
Yep.
We'll see what they say. If it turns into a problem, we can make a difference.
Yep.
All right.
So with that, I think we have your direction, and Ms. Rader just actually emailed me, so I'll follow up with her after this phone call so she can finish up her work on the ordinance.
Great, thank you. All right.
Mr. President.
Mr. Dayhoff.
I'm curious as to how much money we're spending on bond counsel right now. If we were going to bond out $3 million, I would be more than happy to go to bonding it out. But if we're going to do it for $1 million, I'm not predisposed whatsoever to go to a bond. The costs are static, whether we borrow $1 million or we borrow $3 million.
For Ms. Rader's time, potentially. For the issuance costs are typically a percentage of what is being bonded. So those costs would certainly go up, obviously, as well as the city's debt service.
Mr. President, are we compensating bond counsel at the moment for the preparation of these documents?
Well, we certainly are, because I'm sure she's not doing it for free.
That is correct.
Do we indeed have a consensus that we want to bond out $1 million?
Mr. President.
Mr. Yingling, I think that's the path we've been on the whole time. But
I think that to answer Mr. Dayhoff's question, I believe that the Finance Committee would be recommending that we move in this direction.
Well, I'll certainly take the Finance Committee's recommendation into consideration.
Very good, thank you. And I'm sure we can get you some information on Ms. Rader's rates, and so you'll have a fuller picture of
that's not the issue. She has a wonderful reputation. If you were to go to perhaps a bank financing, If we borrow the bond, we can't pay ahead on the bond for 10 years. So if we borrow $1.7 million and we get other proceeds in between, we can't pay ahead on the bond. We're going to pay for that money for 10 years. If we were to borrow it from a bank, if we want to go in that direction, the rate would be approximately the same. The administrative cost would be less, and we could arbitrage it. So I'm not necessarily sure. And then I'm also uncomfortable about if we bond it out, I'm uncomfortable about adding $100,000 a year to the P&L cost analysis on the pool. Where is it that we're going to recover that money? Right now, it's break even. I'm not in favor of bonding out $1 million. I mean, I'm only one vote. I mean, if you guys want to do that, that's cool. I believe in collective judgment.
Mr. President,
Mr. Yingling, yes.
so if I'm hearing Councilman Dayhoff correctly, he's suggesting that one, we either pay out of reserves or go to a commercial bank. Is that right?
Yeah, but I'm not quite, Councilman Yingling, I'm not quite sure what our reserves are at the moment. I haven't gotten a clear picture on that. And then last fall, we asked for our asset to debt ratio, and I haven't seen that report either. So I guess I'm not sure that I have all of the information that I need at this point in time. But the information that I do have is that the cost of borrowing $1 million with a bond is essentially somewhat, well, it's a lot of money. And if we were going to bond $3 million, which we had originally discussed, that's a different ratio whatsoever. I'm just not sure that it's cost effective. I'm not sure that we're getting return off of doing a bond for $1 million. I had asked if we were, I wanted to bond out 45. That would have been smart to leverage that money at that point in time, but it was decided at that time to not do that. I was okay with that. It's collective judgment. But I'm willing to see if finance committee wants to make their case to use bond to bond this out, but you're going to have a tough time with me.
Mr. President,
Mr. Yingling.
I think Mr. Dayhoff raised a question about the reserves. So perhaps Ms. Palmer can kind of give a quick synopsis on what she gave me about, us as the finance committee about the reserves, because that was discussed about paying for it out of reserves. And I think she can shed some light on that right now. So
Sure.
Ms. Palmer.
That's a good thought. Thank you,
Sure.
Ms. Palmer.
Sure, and I'm sorry because I don't have the reports in front of me like I did for the finance committee, so I'm going 100% off of memory, but the general fund has in excess of $10 million in reserves. And normally I would say that's great, and we're in a fine position to finance some of these long-term projects. However, we have a fiber bond out there that's a 30-year bond that is about $1 million in debt a year that we haven't come up with a revenue stream for yet to pay. And so you'll go through your $10 million in reserves in about 12 years on that loan. So I'm a little reluctant about encouraging you to spend the reserves for this project, but again, it's completely entirely up to you. You are the legislative body.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. Mr. Yingling, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I'm just, so Mr. Dayhoff, based on what you're saying now, I don't know how you feel now about the reserves, but hearing that, that was why the finance committee recommended not using reserves based on that information. So whether that makes our case or not, but I think that, we are recommending bonding it.
Mr. President?
Mr. Dayhoff.
I know Green Street's coming off, and I know the garages are coming off. To add another $100,000 to debt service with the financial responsibilities of coming up with Ting, I'm very uncomfortable with that. especially if we can just pull it out of reserves. Reserves hopefully will continue to grow because it's really important for a municipality to have a meaningful rainy day fund. That's just a fiduciary responsibility on our part. But when you look at the cost of bonding out $1 million, I'm just not comfortable with that. You'll have to make your case. I'm only one vote, Councilman Yingling.
So are you, but I thought you just said that you wanted to bond out, you'd rather bond out $3 million. So how are
Yeah,
we
because
going to get debt service on that?
the ratios work out a little bit better. The ratios, the return, there's more return available. We're not going to go to $3 million on the pool anyway, because the return is not there. The return as far as the use for the pool right now, and I'm not sure that would be financially responsible for us right now. I'm pretty darn uncomfortable with borrowing even $1 million for the pool at this point in time, but we got to do something about the pool. I mean, we're not in a, we're almost, our hands are almost forced on that. But to continue to pay money for a bond council right now when I'm not convinced. I mean, I'm only one vote.
Well, and that's just your opinion, Mr. Dehoff. I think there's nothing wrong with paying bond counsel, who's done a great job for us over the years. She's doing what we asked her to do, and it's certainly what you need to do if you're going to pursue bonding. So I think we've acted prudently in that manner, and I'm disappointed that you think it was irresponsible, because I think it was a responsible thing for us to have done under the circumstances. We need to resolve this one way or the other. I mean,
Well,
I think,
I see your
Mr. Dehoff, I'm not finished
your
yet. Thank
point.
you.
Yes, sir.
We need to resolve this and move forward. There's two issues here. One is the Finance Committee's suggestion that we bond this. The hope is that we bond it at less than $1 million, because we will hopefully be able to utilize the funds, and there's no reason to expect that we won't, from the sale of the old school building. So I understand that there are some that the costs are what they are on that, but I think bonding is the traditional and prudent way for municipalities to finance debt. That's historic, and it's the way it works. Or we could take it out of reserves, or we could go and try and take our chances on the markets and see what some bank is willing to do for us. What we need now is a motion about, the Finance Committee has made a recommendation, and I'm going to take that as the motion. The Finance Committee's motion is to go ahead and bond this in some amount. At some point, we will make that final determination when we have the ability, later in several weeks, to be able to make that choice. So
Second.
that's where we are right now. Mr.
Second.
Kalachi?
Well, it doesn't
I'm
need a
seconding
second.
the motion.
It doesn't need a second. It's a committee motion.
Right. Well,
Oh.
it doesn't. That's true. So
Mr. Pecoraro,
yes.
if I may make a suggestion, if you're interested in somewhat using your reserves, that your reserves, at least there's a very good chance that your reserves will be replenished to the tune of $430,000 as a result of the sale of the schoolhouse. I would suggest that you think about that as part of your financing. Your only problem there is that you have to write an ordinance within the next week or so that puts in your max amount of bonding. So if you don't have that money, or you're not expecting to get that money, then you need to bond for more.
Well, if I may, sorry.
Go ahead.
I was just going to simply say, Ms. Palmer is correct. I would say we had planned to introduce the ordinance on Monday. Certainly, if you all there are certain timeframes that we need to publish the public hearing notice, because there is a state requirement for a public hearing, and we need to build in time for the state's bond council to review said public hearing notice. Ms. Rader is primed to basically have this ordinance ready to go for Monday, but that's not even a matter of a week. That's a matter of like the next less than 48 hours. So this is obviously your decision, but once again, I think if there's still issues that you all feel you need to debate, I would give yourself the flexibility, because you have basically about 5 weeks that you could always lower the amount, but once we advertise it, you cannot take it back up, which I think is what Ms. Palmer is also saying.
Right, which is what we're saying. Let's set it at the higher amount, and we will lower it as soon as we are aware of how much fund, when the money comes in from the sale of the old school building. And then we'll be in a position to be able to do that. Any further discussion on this? Are you all ready for the vote? All right, the motion is on the Finance Committee's recommendation, which is to go ahead and bring forward to the council the legislation on bonding set at the higher amount, which we can then reduce later on. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed say nay.
No.
All right, in the opinion of the chairs, the ayes have it, and the ayes have it. So let's move on to the other issue, which is the construction issues at the old bank building. Ms. Matthews?
Yes, thank you very much. I will be brief because obviously that first item took much longer than I believe we all anticipated. So there are 3 change orders that are on your agenda related to the city's contract with Warner Construction. Those would be change orders 5, 6, and 7. What prompted the desire for this meeting in particular was change order number 5, as indicated in the staff memo. This is work that is necessary to correct the existing configuration of structural steel framing uncovered in the 2nd floor. It's in the area of the former one-story convenience store stair located in the southeast corner. The stair and the 2nd floor construction were installed when the bank went through its alteration project back in 1987. And basically we were faced with steel framing that is supporting the stair and 2nd floor were done in a manner that will require extensive modifications to adjust the support locations to properly accommodate the new floor structure, which is basically the fill-in part of the atrium to add office space. Project design team looked at it, determined that it would be much more economical and structurally more efficient to remove 3 of the existing beams that were inserted in 1987 and reconstruct the framing with new steel members. This change order, they looked at 2 options. What is being brought forward is the lower cost of the 2. It has a cost of $23,940.80. And the reason I asked for this meeting today, that this is a critical path item, meaning that if this change order goes unresolved, there is part of Warner's work that is stalled. And if the city is the cause of that inability to move forward, we are subject to general conditions of $1,000 a day. So at the progress meeting yesterday morning, I think everyone sort of agreed that it was in the city's best financial interest to try to get approval of this change order sooner rather than later, so we didn't unnecessarily incur cost of $1,000 a day potentially. Do you want me to go through all the change orders, President Pecoraro, or do you want to just take them one by one and vote? I believe Ms. Fasowski listed them on your agenda separately.
We have them, and we have the memo, and let me just first ask, everybody's gone through it. Would you all like to go through them one by one and get some information, or do you want to just, my view is that they're all things that need to be done. We don't have a lot of, wiggle room here, and we should just move forward and give the staff the ability to save this money. But that's just my thought. Anybody have a different view on that? Okay. I'm sorry, Ms. Thomas, Ms. Gilbert, are you speaking?
Sorry.
Muted.
Mr. President, my
Yes.
understanding when I reviewed all of them where they were all actually required items. So I didn't even foresee that I didn't really understand that there was even a choice in many of them.
Well, I think that's.
There really isn't. That's
Right,
correct.
well, how about a motion then if nobody seems to have any specific concerns, can we get a motion to approve the package? That was Mr. Dayhoff, I believe. Mr. Dayhoff made the motion.
Second.
And a second from Mr. Cavacci. Any further discussion? All right, very good. If you're ready for the vote, all those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed say nay. The ayes seem to have it, and the ayes have it, and the change orders are approved.
Thank you all. I appreciate once again, your willingness to do this on such short notice.
Sure. Well, got to be done. So that takes us through both the unfinished business and the new business. The only item left is citizens' comments. If anybody has any comments, we encourage you to submit them to our city clerk, Shannon Viskoski, at comments@westgov.com. If you'd like your comments to be submitted as a part of the record, please provide your full name and address, and they will be read as submitted comments that include, we will read submitted comments and include the required information during the meeting. They will be reflected in the minutes. Ms. Viskoski, we don't have any from the last meeting as I understand it. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Very good, thank you. All right, well, with that then, we will let everybody get back to their day, and the meeting's adjourned. Thank you all very much. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.